interested in prehistoric Indian artifacts and learning something about prehistoric Indian people, because that's what we're going to talk about. And I hope it's not going to be too dry for you. I'd like to do this. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I'd like to do this real informal because I want to ask you questions and I want you to ask me questions. That keeps things going a little better. The first thing to get started is I want to start out with a question. How do we know that there was people here when the first white settlers came? How do we know there was people here before them? Speak up.
There were
From the
encampments,
artifacts.
weren't there?
Pardon?
There were encampments, weren't there?
Right, the people were still here. The Indians were still here. So we know they were here. Our early white settlers all recorded their experiences with the Indians and things they learned from the Indians. So there was Indians here. We know they were all over the place when the white settlers first came. Now, how do we know they didn't come just a month before the white settlers did? How do we know they were here before that?
Did you do carbon 90 tests on?
Yes, but first radiocarbon tests on what? Artifacts. Okay, where were the artifacts? In the ground. Okay. And typically, as they plowed the ground or something like that, turned the soil or dug foundations, they ran into artifacts. So they knew that because the stuff was in the soil, it had been there for a fairly long period of time. The next question is, how many people were here? How many people were living in the area as the settlers came?
I would think thousands.
There you go. There was thousands. There was literally encampments and settlements all over the area, primarily next to what?
The river.
Next to water, because that was their rivers, that was their mode of transportation. Now, the question that you most frequently get when you're talking about artifacts is, how old are they? So, how can we date them? How can we date artifacts? Well, this is kind of tough. This is kind of tough, and so this is what I'm going to talk about first, and that is, over the years, as people have been looking for artifacts, the first people that were looking for artifacts were primarily looking for something of value. They were actually, the term we use most frequently is pot hunters. They were looking for artifacts that they could display or they thought were valuable or were of some significance. And so they were looking in burial mounds, which are humps on the ground. They were looking in plowed fields, wherever that they might be able to find the stuff they thought was of value. Well, as time went on, there was people who thought, we should learn something about these early people that were here. We want to find out, when did they come? How long have they been here? Were they the first people on Earth? Or were the first people on Earth over in the Southern European and Northern African area? How old were these people here? How long have they been here? And so as there was people that we call archaeologists, or people who study the old, started going into the soil and investigating these sites, they started finding that things were down in the soil further than they thought originally. Originally they thought they were just down a little ways. They'd only been here a little while. But as they started going into the soil, they found sites are way down. They find sites very deep. And the good thing about these archaeologists, as they started going into the soil, is they recorded everything. They recorded what they found a foot down, what they found 2 feet down. And site after site after site after site, hundreds of archaeologists were recording this data throughout the United States of America, or even extenuating areas into Canada or whatever. But they were recording the sites, what they found, what the artifacts looked like, so that over time, as they were constantly excavating on these sites, they started to get a record, a uniform record of, okay, all the artifacts that are down 1 foot look like this, and all the artifacts that are down 2 feet look like this. I'm generalizing. All the artifacts that are down 3 feet look like this. And they kept on going down and finding that the further they got, the older it got, but also the stuff was very similar on these levels. Very similar type of artifacts. And so now what I want to do is I want to just kind of break it down as to how the archaeologists determined the oldest up to the newest stuff. They set up a regular plan so that everything had a name. The very oldest stuff they call Palo. That Palo means very old. The next level of stuff they call Archaic. Archaic is old, means old, but it's a little newer than the Palo. Then they came to what they call the woodland site. And woodland is newer than the Archaic. Then they determined the Mississippian sites, which are the newest or the most recent sites. So they had to give some type of a year, to determine the years for these different levels. So they went with the Palo sites, particularly in this area, but throughout the United States. They're going, I'm going to use the term before present. They used to use BC and AD, but now it's kind of turned to before present. And before present for the Palo sites, we're looking at about 8,000 to 12,000 years before present. For the Archaic sites, you're looking at about 2,000, 2,500, about 2,500 to 7,500 before present. For the woodland sites, you're looking at historic times, which is in this area is considered 1650. From 1650 back to about 2,500, about 2,000 years to 2,500 years. And then also the Mississippian sites are present 1650 back to about 1,000 before present. Okay, that's just roughing it out. Now what I want to do is I'm going to start showing you some artifacts that are type-sited to those different categories of Palo, Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian. And as you might expect, as you go back to the Palo, which is extremely old, we're talking 8,000 to 12,000 years before present, you're not going to have much left because that's a long time. We've only been here for 250 years, and we're talking thousands of years. So consequently, there isn't much. But there is some, and even in this area, all over throughout the United States, there is some Palo material almost everywhere, which is surprising because we feel there weren't many people. Now, the Palo material I have is quite limited. Some of it is not whole, it's only partial, and so I have to show you what I have. And first of all, this is an example of a Clovis spear point. And I will come around so that you can see it, and I'll tell you a few things about it. This Clovis spear point is particularly unique because what it has is, if you can see them as I go around, it has flutes that come up the blade from the back. It's a special chip taken off of the blade that comes up from the back. Now there's a lot of different reasons why people think that's there. Some people think it's because these Palo people were hunting extremely large animals, animals that we no longer have here today. They were hunting mammoth, woolly mammoth, mastodon, ground sloths, a giant type of bison that we no longer have today, a giant type of beaver. And they felt that because they were hunting these great big animals and they couldn't kill the animal, when they pierced the animal, it was impossible to kill it because they were too large. All they were trying to do was get a blood trail from the animal, something they could follow. So they'd wound the animal, they'd follow it till the animal died, and then they would butcher the animal. Well, they felt that because it had this flute on here, that was to help for the blood to run out, so that when they hit the animal, shoved it into them, they literally shoved it into them. There's no throwing, there's no skill to it whatsoever. These spear points were put on a big pole, and maybe one or two people actually jammed that pole right between the ribs on these animals. These animals were large.
They had to get awfully close then.
And what frequently happened is it would be a cooperative thing to try to get an animal. Someone would be distracting the animal while somebody else came up behind it and tried to stick that spear through its ribs and get that animal wounded. Lost my train of thought. Okay. So anyway, then these people would go to the animal to butcher it and probably live by that animal while they were consuming it because they had no means to transport it. These were nomadic people. They had virtually no settlements whatsoever that have been found, especially in the north. In the south now they're finding some sites that look like they were habited for a fairly long period of time. In the north, the artifacts are very random. Once in a while you'll find a few in an area, but not very often. They're pretty scarce, pretty random. This is a base of another. This is made out of a different type of material. There's a base of another, well, it isn't a Clovis, this is a plain view point, but it's still a Palo origin and time period. The same type of thing. It's got a concave base. Now, my theory on this is not this flute, I don't believe was put there for the bleeding part myself. I believe that flute was put there because these animals were so tough that they had to put that stake from their pole from the shaft of their spear, they had to put it literally almost to the point of this projectile in order to, when they hit the side of it, to not break it. I think they found that many times they were hitting the animals and that these points were snapping right off. Look at this one, snapped right across the middle. A pretty good indicator. Most of the Palo I found is snapped in the middle. Maybe here they hadn't learned that, I don't know. But anyway, I think they had to run that pole right to the end because these, take elephant hide. Elephant hide is extremely tough. And that's what we're talking about animals that are like elephants. And it took a lot of force to penetrate them. Yes, sir.
So would that type of artifact be found in Buffalo County?
This part of the artifact is found in Buffalo County. This one here was found by Deer Creek site, right north of here a little ways. And that's a Palo point. This one's probably only about 10,000 years old, whereas a Clovis type would be about 12,000 years old. I'm just going to move on. They made another unique type of artifact, the tool kit. In other words, the tools that these Palo people were using. There was very small toolkit. We find very few artifacts other than the actual spear points. Very few things you find. Other than, once in a while, somebody will find what's called a graver. And there's just a little bitty nodule on the top of this little flake. It's called a graver. Now, these early Palo people seem to make a few of these gravers. The only thing they can think of they were used for is maybe for incising bone. If you know anything about prehistoric people, they liked design. They liked, what do I want to say, decoration, things like that. And the feeling is that they were using these gravers to decorate their spear poles, to decorate any bone tools they might have been using. They used a fair amount of bone tools. That's why some of them are so hard to find, because in especially acidic soils, a lot of the bone is disintegrated where you can no longer find it. So that's just another type of a tool they're used in the Palo. As you got into the later Palo, you started to find another type of artifact. This one here, it's broke on both ends, but it's called agate basin. That's just a later type of a Palo point. And incidentally, the agate basin in Buffalo County around here, quite well dispersed throughout the county. In the agate basin time period, which is about 8,500 to 9,000 years before present, there was quite a few people in this Buffalo County area. And a good many of the sites seem to be on top of the bluff, which makes it actually more difficult to find because there's not much on top of the bluff. So most people consequently don't want to look there because the finds are very limited, other than one or two sites where it's particularly good, but most of the time you want to look closer to the water. But some of the older points, particularly in this county, are found on top of the bluff. And this is part of an agate basin. I've got some good agate basin. I just want to say that most of my good artifacts are at the museum at Alma, and so consequently at home I don't always have some of my best stuff. I try to keep it up at the museum, so I have to use partial things here to talk about, but if you get the gist of it, that's good. Okay, now we're talking about the Palo. We've come to the end of the Palo. We talked about the agate basin. That's at the very end of the Palo period. We come to the Archaic. Why did the archaeologists break it off? Just because of a year time? No, they broke it off because suddenly in the Archaic the toolkit starts to expand. They start finding way more types of tools, way more types of points, more people. It seems like there's far more people. Okay, so as we go into the Archaic period, which Archaic points are in, the early Archaic I have not picked up but very few points in the early Archaic period. I've seen some good examples have been picked up in Buffalo County. I saw a beautiful Thebes point that was found up by Mondovi. That's an early Archaic point. I've seen some St. Charles points that have been found, particularly down by Fountain City. Some were found by Borst Valley. In the Stoll collection at Fountain City, if any of you ever heard of that, at the Fountain City Museum, excellent collection of artifacts, the Stoll collection. There's a few early early Archaic points in that. But as you move into the Archaic, you start finding points that are turned into scrapers. In other words, this was a spear point. This one particularly is about 2,500 years old, a stem spear point, and it was maybe snapped off or something. It was turned into a scraper. The end is sharpened off so that it could be put on a stick or something and used as a scraper. Scrapers doesn't sound like much. Scrapers were important to these people. They were using furs and hides for clothing. They were using furs and hides for their homes. They were using furs and hides to lay on, and you had to get the fat, etc., off of the hide so that you could preserve the hide. Otherwise, it would just stiffen and rot. And so they made scrapers or tools they could use to clear the fat off the hide. They also started to use another tool, and that's a drill. Now this one here happened to be a 5,000-year-old Osceola type spear point that was something happened or whatever happened that they turned it into a drill. Now the point is off the drill, but you can see that it was hafted here and that the drill came down like this. They started expanding their toolkit. They were doing more things. A drill would be classically used for wood, to drill wood, or a perforator, drill or perforator called that.
How come you call it an Osceola? Is that the
That, yeah, okay, I should step back a little bit. And all these points, as they were discovering them in the ground, everywhere they found them, they were giving them a name. They'd give it a name, so if they were talking to another archaeologist, they could say, yeah, I found an Osceola point at this 4 foot down, and yeah, I found an Osceola point at 5 foot down, and I found a Clovis spear point 22 foot down, and I found a Clovis spear point 18 foot down. I mean, they could use the same term, and each one knew what the other one was talking about. So all the artifacts have a name that's been assessed to them over the years. And this way you can converse, you can write material, and everyone knows what you're talking about, okay? I'm going to just stop now and let's look for questions. Maybe I'm not being clear. Yeah, Debbie.
Did the archaeological expeditions or investigations start when the country first developed and as the territories opened up, or was this a later thing that happened?
It was much later. The main archaeology in this country probably started in the early to middle 1800s, and that was not formal archaeology. It was just people who were getting interested in it, and they were going out and looking for artifacts, but they were primarily looking for the artifacts. We're not really recording things real good. It wasn't until almost the 1900s before we started getting a real good recording of the excavations that were taking place. Yeah.
The hide was about 1.5 inches thick on the mammoth, wasn't it?
Oh, they're very thick.
So it would have to be to let the blood out, because how would you get the blood to come out of that animal?
Well, I just felt by the size of the spear they had to use a spear about
I
like
know.
this in order to jam it through the side without it
But then
breaking.
they have spear throwers?
There was spear throwers, but not necessarily in the early payload times.
Well, I don't know, I read some books on that, especially in Europe or over in that country, they had the spear thrower quite early.
Well, they had the spear thrower here quite early too, but I mean, you know, it's possible. See, we're talking about something that all we're doing is finding things in the ground, and we're trying to assess. It's like detective work. We're trying to assess what happened by the few little evidences that you find in the ground, and so it's very hard to say definitely that yeah, they had the spear thrower then, because they found some spear throwers throughout. Well, not in this area, but very far northern Alaska area. They found some in the southwest.
But wasn't this valley full of water when the glaciers melted? That's why they followed the mammoths up on these ridges.
Can be true, although I found payload points that are down in the lowland too. You know, you'd think that, but it's not necessarily so.
Well, I know the mammoth was down on the lowland because I found the tooth.
Okay, see, I mean, there's evidence of it, and very often when you find those mammoths, associated with them are the spear points or are the tools where the early people butchered them. Any other questions, and I'll continue with my stuff. Okay, okay, we're moving into archaic. I did talk a little bit about the early archaic. I went to the middle archaic. The middle archaic had this side notch type point like this. Here's another one, just smaller. That's all. They were notched on the side. And the other thing that happened by the early to middle archaic is we're looking at different animals. We are no longer looking at mammoth and mastodon. We're starting to look at elk, deer, animals that we're familiar with. Why was that? It's because the whole area was changing. We were in more of a tundra situation in the Paleo period. The glaciers were just north of us, or east and west even maybe. But now as we get into the Archaic period, the glaciers are retreated. We're starting to get our type of oak and oak savannas in this area. We no longer have that tundra type area with very little trees and very little vegetation. We're getting much more of our type of riverine climate we're used to right here now. And so consequently, the artifacts start changing. Now, is it the same people doing it? I don't know. How do you tell? I don't know. But they are changing their toolkit. They're changing the way they're making the artifacts. They're changing the way they're hafting them. We're still in a time period where it's all spear points. It's all spear type or dart point it's called if you're using a atlatl spear thrower, which is a little more complicated type of a weapon, but it was used somewhat, not too much in this area as much as it was in different areas of the country. As you move through the middle Archaic and come to the late Archaic period, which now we're talking, I use 5,000 for the middle Archaic. For the late Archaic, we're talking 2,500 years ago. The points start going to stemmed points. You start to see a stem on the top of the points. The stem points at 2,500 years ago, these people are still hunting the same way. Why they changed the hafting on their points, who knows? You can't really figure it out. We don't have the evidence. If you did something, you're just guessing at it. But anyway, the points start to stem. And of course, these all have different names too. These are Kramer-like or something like that they're called. And the size is starting to get smaller because animals are after are smaller. They don't need as big a point to kill that animal. You don't have to carry as much around to get that type of animal. You can possibly now start bringing the animal back to your campsite as you get into particularly the late Archaic, much more sedentary. People are starting to build some type of a habitat, some type of habitation. They're more in villages, they're more in encampments, much more social. You start to see personal adornments in the late archaic. People are making things that they're using themselves, hairpins. You start to see copper, a few pieces of copper that are used for decoration, maybe on some type of a chest decoration or something like that. Also, just dropping back a little bit in the middle archaic, when I was at that Osceola I mentioned, that's this type of point at the 5,000 before present. We also in Wisconsin had what's called the old copper people. Now these are people that primarily used copper for their toolkit. They were getting native copper from northern Wisconsin, and they weren't just living there, they were definitely trading it and transporting it clear down into southern Wisconsin. Their old copper pieces are found in this county. I believe it's Bourse Valley there was an old copper settlement. The Stoll collection had 3 copper pieces when I originally looked at it. That came from I think it was from Bourse Valley. And but now I think it only has 2 left, because shortly before he died, he traded 1 piece for a artifact from Iowa. But anyway, so there was these old copper people that primarily hammered copper, native copper, and they did some heating of it also and hammering it in order to shape it and form it.
Max, are these local collections in the historical societies around here, like Fountain City and Alma, are they mainly from local people that were born and raised here and they just found these things?
Pretty much. Pretty much. As a matter of fact, I can tell you the Stoll collection at Fountain City. Mr. Stoll had a hardware store, and what he'd like to do is, if farmers or whoever came into his hardware store and brought him artifacts, he would trade them for things in the store. And he did that for many years. And
did he record where they supposedly found them?
He knew in his mind where a lot of them came from. I was fortunate enough to still get there when he remembered a lot of them, so I knew where a lot of them had come from. But he never recorded it, no. Written on paper. But, I know I was talking about local, yeah. And so most everything he has is from the local Fountain City area. I would say from the Trempealeau River to Fountain City. Everything I've picked up is from generally the Chippewa River to here and through Alma, and maybe over the hills a little bit, but up Highway 37 a ways, or up the Buffalo River a ways. Okay, we're going to move on. Then as we come out of the archaic, the major delineation between the archaic and the woodland period is this. What's this? Can anybody see what that is?
Streakers?
No. What does it look like?
Oh, pottery.
Pottery. That's right. They started to develop pottery, and that's what the archaeologists used to delineate the archaic from the woodland. Is they started to find pottery on the sites, and so the early woodland, you start to find a real thick pottery like this, Marion thick it's called. You don't find it very often, but you do find some around here. This particular one again came from the Deer Creek site, that's just north of here a ways. And along with that, the artifacts turned to a little bit different. This is an early woodland spear point. We're still in spears, and the dating on this would be about 2000 to 2500 before present. Now the toolkit in the late archaic and into the early woodland is essentially the same. The big change is the pottery. It is the pottery. Most of the sites are sites where people were living there. They started to be much more sedentary. The only difference is in the woodland people seem to disperse in the winter. They lived in groups, communities in the summer, in the easy times we call it, and then in the winter they seemed to disperse so that they weren't putting as much of a, they weren't exploiting the food sources, the animals, whatever, so much in the one restricted area. They wouldn't have to keep walking further and further and further to get to where there was any deer left or whatever there happened to be in the winter. They wanted to disperse out into the valleys and whatever, or near creeks someplace for the winter where they weren't so close together and they could get at their food sources much easier during the winter. But it's mostly just common sense. They used American ingenuity before we did. You know, they were. Then, as we go into the middle woodland, you start to get a little different type of a point. Middle woodland, you start to get what's called a contracting stem. The stem comes up, it's almost semicircular, contracting type stem. The points are smaller. These particular are called Wabisa contracting stem. One's a Dixon. Then there's also the notch points were like this, and that's called a Schneider's. This Schneider's type point is indicative of what's called a Hopewell culture. It's just a little different culture that's within the woodland tradition. The Hopewell was known because they became quite powerful. It originated in the Ohio area, and it grew and moved west. It came into Wisconsin. There was two main factions of it. There was the Ohio Hopewell, and there also was the Southern Illinois Hopewell. The Hopewell tradition we have here that's called Havana. That's the Southern Illinois tradition. The closest site we have to here of the Hopewell is at Trempealeau, Wisconsin. Quite a large Hopewell settlement there. Hopewell were noted for their very large burial mounds. And if you've ever visited Perot Park at Trempealeau, you'll find that the park is full of middle woodland Hopewell burial mounds. And right as you come in the park, they start right away and they're dispersed all through the park. Like I said, their pottery for that Hopewell tradition is called Havana. Now I have found a fair amount of Havana pottery right up next to Nelson, right next to the water, right next to where they have their sewerage pits. And there seems to have been some amount of Hopewell, middle woodland occupation there. It's easiest to say what tradition it is by pottery because the pottery is so distinctive in their design. I'm going to try to pick up some pieces here that have design on them that I can show, and I don't know if you can see them or not, but you'll see they have a distinctive design on these happen to be rim shirts from the rim of a pot. They have a distinctive design. And so it's very easy when you see that distinctive design say, oh yeah, this one here is Buffalo River cord impressed. The only place you find this particular design is here by the Buffalo River. This is named for right here, the Buffalo River, right out here. Buffalo River cord impressed. It's the only place they find this design, right in this area. Then here's another one that has a different type of a design. So that's why potsherds are actually almost better than artifacts because they're so distinctive. The same people like to make the same type of pot. It seems to hang that way much better than for artifacts. Okay. Any questions on that part?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Now, when you said you found it here and there was this site, now who gets to go and dig up this stuff? Just anybody can go there and look around? How's that
not that
work?
way. Right nowadays there is distinct laws on that, and unless you particularly own the land, you could dig on your own land if you own it. They really cannot stop you from that. But if it's other private land, it's public land or anything. We've got antiquity laws that cover that, and an ordinary person could not go and delve into those sites at all. You'd have to be authorized by some particular reason to go and dig a site. As a matter of fact, nowadays most archaeological sites are dug salvage sites, and that's because a highway is changing, a building is being built that's going into a site or something like that, where a site may be destroyed, and information that's in that site would be destroyed if they just went ahead and bulldozed it apart. And so what happens is, before highways are changed, before new malls are built or something, they generally have an archaeological excavation there of some type, and they check into that site and see if there's anything there that should be salvaged or should be looked into before it would be destroyed. And so that's primarily how sites are found, and not found, but are dug today, is primarily out of salvage. Although there's a few sites that are dug because they're looking for a particular thing, or a school is investigating something. Yeah.
When you find your stuff around here, are you digging, or do you stumble across it on the surface, or?
Right. I have never dug anything in this area in my whole life. I did dig when I was going to archaeology school in southern Illinois. I did dig down there on sites, but here I never have. I strictly hunt plowed fields. A couple places I do look in the water where a bank happens to be washing away, where I know there's stuff, I might find stuff in that area, but otherwise I just primarily look in plowed fields, which is making it very limited nowadays, because the no-till and different things throughout the country have made it very hard to get new things brought to the surface. Any other questions right now? I'll move along a little more here. Yeah, and then as we come to, I talked a little about middle woodland now, as we come to late woodland, we're looking at about 1,500 years before present. We're getting right in the area where, and I'm going to see if somebody can figure it out. Our projectile points are starting to look like this.
Bird point.
Bird point.
Arrows.
Arrowhead, that's right. They developed the arrow around 500 to 800 AD, depending on which particular place you were. They developed the arrow. And instead of having a spear for everything, suddenly we got the bow and arrow. And saying the year it specifically came is hard, because look at, for example, when television came. Not everybody got a TV the first year television came. There was somebody had a TV in that town, and somebody had a TV in that town. Well, then a few years later, there was more TVs there and more TVs there. Well, not everybody got it. It was a 10, 15-year period maybe where till everybody had television. Well, it's the same way with the bow and arrow. Some Indians were happy with their spear pointer, didn't want to change, whereas other ones were using arrows. So, I mean, these technological advancements came as people saw a need for them, as they became necessary. And so suddenly our projectile points became very small as you get into the late woodland period. Small notched points. You can see they're hard to see because they're so small. And these points, Neil says, are bird points. Well, they've killed an awful lot of birds like you and me. They were used for everything. This point was used for everything. It was used for war. It was used to kill people just as much as it was used to kill deer. It was used to kill turkeys. It was used to kill anything they were after. Once you got arrows, they seemed to stick with the arrows. They liked the arrows for everything. That was their major weapon. By the late woodland period, the toolkit is tremendous. We have all variety of drills and awls and fish hooks and scrapers, and I'm speaking of the artifacts that remain in the soil. The pottery, we have loads of pottery. The pottery becomes much finer, a much thinner, finer pottery, still cord impressed if you're in the woodland, still cord impressed. Also much more personal adornment. You find ear spools, you find lots of things for the hair, different things in the hair. You find, actually there was quite a lot of, you start finding things for children, dolls and toys and things that the children were using are found in excavations. And another reason for that, and that is because it's much more recent. It hasn't had as long to decay. It hasn't had as long to be destroyed. So you've got much more, artifacts, much more debris on your sites, stuff like that, much more stuff. And I'm just generalizing here. I'm not trying to bore you with a lot of stuff from the different periods. I'm going to quickly move into the, this is a typical woodland drill here. I don't know if I had showed a whole drill. This is a whole woodland drill. That's primarily for working wood. It wasn't good enough to work anything more than that. They had a system for drilling stone. They used sand with it, a sand and a reed. Took a long time, but they could do it. But I mean, there's lots of artifacts, but I'm just generalizing. And then suddenly, about 1,000 years before present, we had the Mississippian. It seems like a movement that came up the Mississippi River. That's why it's called Mississippian. The biggest Mississippian complex was at St. Louis, called Cahokia. Tremendous Mississippian complex there. These Mississippian people were much more agricultural. They were primarily planting crops. They did some hunting too. They did some fishing, but their crops were their big thing. And that's why they were able to have big communities. Middle Mississippian is designated by large communities. Cahokia at St. Louis is about 40,000 people in one community. If any of you have ever been by there, the most notorious thing at Cahokia Mounds Complex, which is tremendous, the most notorious thing is Monk's Mound. It's 13 acres of earthen mound, one single mound, 13 acres. It's the largest earthen mound in the world. And it's at Cahokia, Illinois. It's a wonderful place to stop and visit. There's a whole complex of mounds in that area. You can see mounds about as far as you can see in every direction. A lot of them have been destroyed because of St. Louis span of the city, but quite a lot of it was saved because people wanted to save it. Real good interpretive center at Monk's Mound. They've got tours. You can go up on the mound and come down. It's an interesting place. Anyway, the Middle Mississippian was similar to the Hopewell. It was a very strong tradition. They had outposts away from Cahokia. Cahokia was kind of like a ceremonial center. They had outposts. One outpost happens to be in Wisconsin. It's called Aztalan. It's over in eastern Wisconsin near Jefferson. That's a Middle Mississippian settlement. One of the things that denotes the Middle Mississippian settlement from every other type of people we talked about so far, and that is that Middle Mississippian, for some reason, the people lived in stockades. They were defensively protecting themselves. They had, very similar to what you see, our early, and I'm not so sure they didn't get it from the Indians, and that is our early forts were built with big wood structures with poles sticking up. That's exactly how the Middle Mississippian sites were built. The one at Aztalan, Wisconsin, encompassed 23 acres, and it was completely poled in. They had what you call towers. They had towers up about every 80 feet or so. They had a tower that went up that people from inside the fort could get on for defensive purposes. Prior to this, we see no evidence of defense whatsoever. But the Middle Mississippian apparently weren't getting along with somebody. So, but anyway, they had a huge amount of artifacts you find there. people suddenly became a real status difference between people. And how could that possibly be denoted that there's a big status change between people?
Decoration.
Yeah, decoration, specifically on the burials. They found burials within the Aztalan, particularly, where they accidentally came upon the one was a young girl, maybe 17, 18 years old, and she was completely adorned with shell beads wrapped around her. There was, I forget, like 23,000 shell beads that were all pierced and drilled, were wrapped around her all the way around full length of her body in that burial. Definitely you had some particular status she had over other people who are found that are just buried in a you know, a regular laid out position. And you find that in the middle Mississippi, and particularly that was the same way when you got into St. Louis in the Cahokia Mounds area. You see much more status for some people. Another way you see that status is grave furniture. And grave furniture is artifacts, some of the best artifacts that people ever made. They would put with particularly beloved or particularly high level people when they buried them. And so some of the burials that are found, particularly in the middle Mississippian, a whole array of beautiful artifacts are found with those burials. Vessels, projectile points, whatever seemed especially valuable to them. Coming in, we don't particularly, we have a little bit of middle Mississippian. There seems to be some Mississippian influence in the Trempealeau area too. They found a few. They have a distinctive type projectile point called the Cahokia point, named for St. Louis, but it has a notch in the base of the point. I don't particularly have any because I've never hunted where they're found around here. But anyway, that Bob has some over there. He's made some. I don't know if he's over there now or what. Okay, and then around here, what we have a lot of is Upper Mississippian. It's called Oneota, and don't confuse that with Oneida. It's Oneota. It's just a name that is given to that Upper Mississippian complex. And around here, the thing you find, particularly for them, is you find a straight triangular projectile point. It just looks like a little triangle. No notches on it. And there was a very good reason why they started making them this way. I don't know if anybody would think of it or not, but it's because they found that, like I showed you the late woodland, using the small notch points, they were actually binding this arrowhead to the shaft of the arrow by those little notches. In other words, they were using that to bind this to the arrow. And then when you shot somebody with that arrow, when you pulled it out, you got the arrowhead that came along with it because it was bound to it. But now when you got in the Upper Mississippian time period with the straight triangular with nothing on the base, all they did is split the shaft of the arrow, like my two fingers, and insert that arrowhead, and when they shot somebody with this, when they pulled the shaft out, the arrowhead stayed in. And that, as you would know, I'm sure, would infect and whatever, and so eventually you'd get the person, even if they could pull the arrow out. So it was more of made it more of a lethal weapon than the hafted arrow was. It made it more of a lethal weapon. The toolkit expands tremendously. One of the big things for Upper Mississippian people, the pottery, instead of being sand tempered or grit tempered, it becomes shell tempered. And as you can see on this piece, you can see the white. You can see the white on the bottom all around this piece. That's because it's crushed shell used for temper in their pottery. The only people that did that is Mississippian people. Not so much on middle. The Middle Mississippian people at Aztalan did, but they didn't at St. Louis. At St. Louis, they still use grit and sand for temper, but in Wisconsin, they did use shell. And the design gets a little plainer. I don't know, it's hard to see the design on here. I'm going to take all my stuff when I'm done here, and I'm going to put it on a table over there. I've got a lot more stuff that I'm not going to be showing that I'll show in there. And you can come and look at it and ask me about it. But you can see the design. There's a little more subtle design. It's more of a trailed design on the Mississippian pottery. Like I say, it's shell tempered. Also, we start to see pipes come in. There was pipes prior to this in the woodlands, particularly the Hopewellian. This just happens to be Mississippian type of pipe. It's pipestone. Hard to tell where the pipestone comes from. It could be from Pipestone, Minnesota. It could also be from Pipestone up near Ladysmith, Wisconsin. Fairly large Indian pipestone quarry up there. This, of course, this pipe is broken. Like I say, I got mostly broken stuff at home. I have one nice whole pipe, a Micmac pipe at the museum that's in perfect shape. This is drilled, and you can see the drill hole that went into the bowl. The bowl sat on this end right here. Although I think this was more of an elbow pipe, it probably was more like this.
What did they smoke?
They smoke Kinneconnect is what it's called, and that's a combination of many different things. One of the big things in it was red willow leaves. Also, people say there was some marijuana in it. I don't know, but it was called Kinneconnect. Anybody know what Indians called pipes? There's a word for it, and it's the name of a city in this country. Many Indian words always become cities. Calumet. Indian pipes, Calumet. Then also in the upper Mississippian time period, you start to see perforators more like this. They're just off of a flake. It kind of resembles that graver that I showed you for the Palo times, but these are awls or perforators. This is primarily probably for making holes like in hides and stuff for attaching and sewing, stuff like that. Your scrapers become a little more distinctive. The type of material that they were using in the upper Mississippian, primarily in this area, you can see this looks kind of glassy. Hickston silicified sandstone comes from Hickston Mound, Hickston, Wisconsin. Silver Mound, Hickston, Wisconsin. 90% of all the artifacts you find on upper Mississippian sites in this area came from that Hickston Mound. You know how far away that is. They had to transport all of that to this area. The trade became great. They transported it in planks like this. This is how they transported it. This came off a upper Mississippian site. They'd go to Hickston, or they would trade with somebody who was at Hickston, and they'd get these type of nodules, and then they'd work these nodules into their toolkit, into their artifacts. And if you want to see how artifacts were made today, you just go see that Bob Kuiper. He'll be doing it over there, and there's nobody better than I know than he is. Just excellent at it. I used to sit here and then I'd peck away on this stuff a little bit, just try to show how it was done, but I can't even come close to what he can do. He's a beautiful napper and does just an excellent job. So you'll want to visit him later on today to see. I don't know what time he's doing this stuff, but he's got examples over there of stuff he's done. He does a wonderful job. Now, I could show other artifacts here too. I just don't want to go too long. Kelly, you'll have to cut me off. As you get into that upper Mississippian time period, I said there was a lot more was denoted to agriculture. This is a matati, called a matati. I took this off a Mississippian site. These are manos. These were used for crushing their grain, for grinding their grain. That's what this was, is a mano and matati. These manos are highly polished on the flat side. They're just polished like glass from constant grinding. Never went into pecked and polished type stones. Axe heads, Axe heads started to come in the archaic time period. And axe heads were primarily used for wood, working wood, chopping poles, chopping trees. It's primarily a woodworking tool. They used it just like we use an axe today. The only difference from this one to the archaic period is most of the archaic axe heads did not have a groove going all the way around. They only had a groove going 3/4 of the way around. One side is not grooved. That's the way they hafted them. That was the way they did it in the archaic. As you get more toward the woodland time period, then the groove starts coming all the way around the axe head. And then as you get toward the Mississippian times, late woodland and the Mississippian times, you started to go to celts. These are celts. Actually, it would be like this. They're both broken. You got the bit and you got the pawl. This one here, the hole like this is full size. Only thing is it's broken half. The lengthways way, I call this celt, sharp and polished on this edge. Anybody know how you make these? This is called periphery. It's got little white dots on it. They call it periphery, but it's a basalt. It's a basalt. This is basalt. This is basalt. I will show you how they were made. And it doesn't take long. This is called a hammer stone. This is a basic stone that they used to form all stone, starting from way back. The Indians used hammer stone. That's what this is called. It's a round, fairly round nodule that's quite hard. It's a very hard material. Here's a basaltic cobble. I picked this up on a site, and someone was working it. They were working it into a celt or an axe head. I would say a celt. And what you do is you pound. You pound on this cobble like that. And if you watch as I'm pounding, you can see the material coming off. It's just a matter of constant pounding. And then maybe grinding it off a little bit like that. And then starting to pound again. You can see the material coming off. It takes about 40 hours to make an axe head or a celt. And that's not long. I mean, it sounds long, but that's not long. That's what these people had to do. Their job was making their toolkit, was getting what it takes to extract the food from nature that they needed. And so to them, that was not a big deal.
What was a celt used for?
A celt is the same. A celt is the same as an axe head. I'm just going to bring this one out here so I can show again. The celt is the same as an axe head, okay? With an axe head, you had to bind this to the handle by some means. In other words, usually this type was put in the handle like this and then bound on this end and bound on this end to make it tight. But the more you chopped with it, the looser it got. Because as long as you're using leather or something to tie this on, the more you hit it, the looser it's going to get. But now, as we get into late woodland and into the Mississippian times, the technology improves. And this is an improvement because instead of binding this, you take a chunk of tree limb, maybe that has a little knob or something on it, and you dig that out so that it just fits. This celt just fits into it. That's why the pawl end generally is pointed, so that it just fits in. Now when you pound with it, the more you pound, the tighter it gets. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter the more you pound with it. So it was a technological advancement, just like a musket to a rifle, you know. How am I doing for time here?
Finish up soon.
Other types of tools that are found here, mostly from middle woodland on. Net weights. Net weights are characterized because it's always a wide stone and the notches are on the side. The notches are on the side, another net weight. A wide stone, notches on the side. Some particular reason that wide stones seem to be better, but I've found 25, 30 of them, and the notches are always on the wide side. Net weights.
What do they use for, Max?
Net weights are used for two things here that I know. One is for fish, and I believe the other one is for birds. And the reason I say that is because at one particular site I hunt, a bench comes up, and then it tapers off with another long bench, and I've noted there many mornings I found quite a few net weights along that, right where the bench breaks off. I found quite a few net weights right along that edge. And I've noted many mornings when I was hunting there early that birds coming out the valley, they always dipped real low, actually below my head, as they were heading toward that river bottoms. And I believe that those net weights are located there because they were putting nets there and they were catching birds in them that were coming to that river bottoms in the morning. And they had fresh birds for breakfast. Another thing is you got into the Mississippian times, you started to see gaming stones. And these particular things are broke, both of them in half, but it would have looked like this. They're called a chunky stone. It was a round discordial, and they were used as a gaming piece. Two theories on it. One of them is all your braves lined up in a straight line. One person stood a certain distance in front of them. He rolled this on the ground across in front of them. They all shot their arrows at it, and if anybody hit it, he was the winner. That's the one theory. The other theory is that they all lined up, somebody threw this, and then they tried to see who could come the closest to it by shooting their arrows. I don't know which way it was. Maybe somebody does. Maybe Jim knows there.
I've got a big one in order.
Oh yeah, they're all different sizes. Yeah, and some are very decorative.
Yeah, it's just, it looks like it was turned on a lathe.
Right. Yeah, some are just beautiful. But the only other thing I got setting here is I have a particularly unique artifact that's found only, as far as I know, only in this area. I know many archaeologists. None of them have ever seen one on a site anywhere. Ernie Bossart, La Crosse Archaeological Center, excavates a lot, primarily just south of here. Has never seen one on a site. I've found probably a dozen of them. I call them a round knife. You can see they're fairly thin, actually fairly sharp. I've found probably about a dozen of them around here. I call a round knife. I don't know particularly what it was used for. Maybe cutting cattail or reeds or something for making baskets, or I don't know. Good question, but I do find that particularly unusual artifact. Now, questions? Yeah.
What happened to the people that were here and living when the white people came, and where did they disperse to, or what happened to them?
You know, there's two different things happen. One of them is some of them actually almost amalgamated in with the population. A very good example of that is any of you have read Kermit Cook's book, Soldier Boy's Letters to his mother and father. The back part of that book has a canoe trip he took in 1868, and it was up the Chippewa and then back down the Chippewa. And in that book, he tells very much about how they were looking forward to hitting the Indian encampments as they went. They were purchasing or trading with them for maple sugar, and how friendly they were, and they were friendly to him. He talks about in the Civil War part of that book how he grew up and was raised with a couple of Indian children in the Gilmanton area, and how he'd learned so much from them and played with them all his life and stayed with them in their home, and they'd stayed with him in his home. And so they were actually, in some areas they were very cosmopolitan or whatever. I mean, they all lived together and had no problem, whereas some areas there was conflict, and wherever there was conflict, you know who lost. I mean, they were either annihilated, or they were driven off, or they were transported to a reservation. More questions? Yeah.
When the ladies or the women made beadwork, how were those beads drilled?
Okay, it was called like a whirl drill, or I don't know exactly the term for it. It was like they'd take the bow and they'd wrap the string around a stick, and on the stick they had, I've got this drill here, but I've got drills that are real fine, real small, real thin. They could put that drill on a stick, mounted on a stick, on top of whatever they wanted to drill. You hold it on the top, you take that bowstring, you pull it back and forth, and that thing is spinning just like a drill on your drill press or on your hand drill. And it spins on, they spin it like this, and it's spinning around on that, and eventually drills a hole through it.
How'd they hold the bead?
I don't know how you hold
You'd
the
have to
bead.
have
I'm
two
sure
hands
maybe
for
they
that.
had two people doing it. Maybe
Yeah.
somebody's holding the bead. But I know that's how it's
Did
done.
some of the Indians come here from over by Chief Waukesha? I wonder if they ever came over to this area too then?
Yes, but I can say yes and no, because this was a conflicting territory generally through this area. You've got what I would say Chippewa Indians, or Oneida probably at that time, and you've got the Dakota Indians, and generally that was kind of a conflicting territory across the Mississippi there. And a good example of that is I'll use another term that I haven't used here today, that's ethnographic record, and that is, at the time there was a big battle, there was a German ethnographer that was living with the Oneida people. He'd been with them for 4 years, and he came along with them as they came to the Mississippi River, and they had a battle with the Dakota Indians who were living at Waukesha, Waukesha. But anyway, at Wabasha, at Grand Encampment, which is across the river, a little below Wabasha, and there was a battle took place on the Wisconsin shore, and it happens to be almost exactly near that Jayhawk, a little bit south of the Jayhawk, and there was one Indian killed in the battle. This German ethnographer recorded the whole battle. He said it was more pomp and circumstance than it was actually fighting, but he said, you know, that's how he recorded it, you know, and there was one person killed, and he said then everybody quit and went back their respective directions. But there was a huge battle one time at Battle Island up the Chippewa River where there was hundreds, literally hundreds killed at that battle.
But didn't they have a certain day when they kind of called it a neutral day and when they traded?
That could be, I don't know, we're getting to historic times, which I am not.
Is there any recording from that, or where would it be in
It's
from
in
that
a
German?
book called Kitchigami. It's printed by the Minnesota Historical Society. It's a book about that thick. It's just a tremendous, it's his 4 years of living with the Oneida Indians. A tremendous ethnographer. He recorded stuff just as he saw it. He didn't put his feelings into it one way or another. Very good ethnographer, very good book. I think I'm supposed to be getting it.